The reactions to Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail's main story quests have been mixed. The one thing that has received almost universal praise is the battle content, the duties, be it solo, the dungeons, trials, or even the newly released raid, the Arcadion. And I say almost universally because there is a group that hasn't been all too happy with the new difficulty level found in these activities. I'm not in that camp. I love the new battle content. I have enjoyed every duty that Dawntrail has thrown my way. Although I like them all overall, some are simply better than others, so let's take a look at the dungeons that came with the launch of Dawntrail. The ones that are part of the main story and the expert dungeons unlocked at level 100 after the conclusion of the MSQ. And if you want to know what I thought of Dawntrail's story, take a look at the video popping up on the note right about now. Better yet, open that one in a new tab, watch this video, and then go watch the other one. And if you like any of them, drop them a like, help share, and maybe even subscribe. The following ranking is subjective as all hell. Don't expect a shred of objectivity, but I base my decision and my ranking on various factors, which I'll mention as I go through the different dungeons, but there are a couple that are key: complexity and difficulty. By complexity, I mean the number of mechanics the bosses have and how challenging they are to execute. Basically, how much attention you need to pay. A complex boss may even be one where you might need to break the rule of always be casting to properly execute the mechanics. Difficulty, on the other hand, is a combination of the damage inflicted by the boss with his attacks and how harshly a boss might punish your mistakes. In relation to the vulnerability debuff, which you get if you fail to execute a mechanic, a good measure of difficulty is often, can you survive a second failure, aka get a second stack, or will the next mistake drop you? Related to the above is one aspect of combat gameplay that I enjoy a lot, and that's overlapping attacks, when bosses combine multiple of their moves or execute them in quick succession. That is my favorite part of the Final Fantasy XIV boss design, the dance. Now, without further ado, it's time to rank these dungeons. Coming up last, at number 8 is Workor Sormor, aka the Big Scary Mountain, the second main story dungeon at level 95. This dungeon has us climb the imposing mountain that is highlighted in the intro sequence to Urkopacha, with the intent of reaching the summit and meeting the high luminary of the Yokhui, Gurfurlur, for the feat of proof. The reason I place this dungeon at the last position is that, for one, its bosses are less complex and difficult compared to the previous dungeon, Ihuikatumu, which is the introductory duty for Dawntrail. Not only that, but its flow is identical to that other dungeon. You fight one boss and then your progress is hindered by another competitor, in this case Soralja, forcing you to take the long way around. It has the exact same beats and thus doesn't stand out. Visually it's stunning, of course, but that's not enough to rank it higher. The highlight of the dungeon is Gurfurlur, and it's the one boss that makes me wish we had extreme or savage versions of the dungeons, because his mechanics are well suited for some crazy combinations and overlaps. We get some of it in the fight, but only one overlap of his elemental tiles. I wanted to see more, even if it was just in the last 10% of his health. At number 7 we have Ihuikatumu. It's the intro dungeon, and despite having seen some of it in the coverage of the press tour, I really enjoyed the story elements of the dungeon, such as the starting trash being part of Bakul Jaja's shenanigans, and even having to step off the boat because of his interference, with Thancred later on also interfering with our progress, forcing us into the second boss fight. The bosses are a great intro to Dawntrail, already adding some hectic mechanics to it all, setting the tone for what is to come perfectly. At number 6 is Origenics, the penultimate dungeon in the main story quest at level 99. A dungeon that tells the story of our group traveling through the bowels of Everkeep up to Soralja's throne, by going through the very factory of souls that powers the Alexandrian armies and, well, people. Origenics is a great dungeon with some really interesting bosses and a heightened sense of stakes given its place in the story. But there are two elements that bring it down in quality for me. The first one is the unforgiving nature of the first boss's damage. This thing can one-shot you in ways the other dungeon's bosses or even Soralja can't. That poison splash damage is insane. Now, this will probably come up again in this list, but for me, in a dungeon, the complexity and difficulty of the bosses should be incremental. Start out easier and pile on the difficulty. I feel the first boss has a much higher difficulty than those coming after it, breaking this rule, so down it goes in the rankings. And the second issue is that the trash mobs in this dungeon are damage sponges, especially the last 3 enemies right before the final boss. They take a while, too long in fact, especially if it's your first run at the dungeon. Lastly, and this is a nitpick, I hate the name Origenics. I just don't like it. Number 5 is the Sky Deep Cenote at level 95. I really don't have that much to say about this one. It's very much middle of the pack in every respect. It escalates the difficulty level, the complexity of the boss fights, and how much attention you need to pay to what the bosses are actually doing. It's a dungeon with striking visuals, with a nice transition from the cenotaph to the quarry to the electrum threshold of the Golden City. It's a dungeon that tells a story just on its visuals alone. First showing you its present as a tomb used by the Mamulja, most of it waterlogged. Then we transition to the quarry we heard so much about, where the Yokhui had their dreams of gold. And then we find the truth hidden beneath it all. The goal for the right of succession, the Golden City, or what we thought was the Golden City. I also like that the start is a simple beast, but as we dig deeper, the bosses are constructs left behind to guard the place and its secrets. Highlight is the second boss, in particular its recoil shot mechanic. I don't think I've seen that one used all too often in Final Fantasy XIV, which made the whole thing feel very fresh. I would have liked that boss to have a few more things going on, because very quickly it runs out of things to look out for. And you're just doing this waltz of ricochet shots and avoiding mines. It's a well put together dance, but could have used a little something else, especially considering how much the first and third bosses have going on for them. So following my previous rule, it's a step up in difficulty but a step down in complexity. Number 4 is Vanguard, one of my favorite dungeons in the entire MSQ. It's frantic, has a bright color scheme, looks high-tech as all hell, giving us a tremendous shift in visuals compared to the previous duties, and it follows a great train cutscene and marks a distinct increase in difficulty. Vanguard is unlocked at level 97, and it's the fortress that acts as the doorway between Shaktural and the nation of Tulyolal, and the dome consuming Yasudani, which we'll later find out is now Alexandria. The second boss is the highlight for me, with its bullet hell mechanics, being one of the best examples of Dawntrail's predilection for the enemy attacks that overlap with one another, forcing you to react faster and even memorize where some of those attacks might be coming from. The first time I ran the dungeon, the little barriers the boss erects before forcing you to run around in circles got me. I didn't think the little lasers would be too much of a problem and got mercilessly butchered as a result. Learn my lesson swiftly. And the last boss is not only fun, but also a great introduction to the kind of dangerous people Soralja has in his army, capable of becoming monsters by using their little devices, which at the time we still didn't know too much about. I particularly like the double face aspect of the boss, first a human only and then a transformed state, with the first acting as a bit of tutorial for what's to come later. It's rather elegant boss design. And the snake boy is tricky, you gotta pay attention to that tail of his, or you're in for a world of hurt. It helps that the gear from this dungeon is just glam eye candy. I need to run this dungeon a lot more to get as much of the gear as I can. Only problem is that with my luck, every time I run it, the gear that drops is for every other job except mine. If I were to offer a downside, it would be the first boss, because it's nowhere near as memorable as the other two, feeling a lot more like an ad fight, or even worse, a third trash pack. Number 3 is Stray Burrow Dead Walk, the first of the expert dungeons, unlocked at level 100 after the end of the main storyline for Dawntrail, and very much the Halloween town of Final Fantasy XIV. The only thing missing is the monster singing "This is Halloween." Stray Burrow Dead Walk is creepy, and the look of the place is a nightmarish playground. A place that in its exile went full-on twisted, and the spirits and NPCs within went full-on cuckoo. The fact that it's a lost district of living memory is a great story that adds some life to the final zone of the MSQ, and also serves as a final farewell to it, as it's implied that with the Burrow of Peace and its souls released, it's only a matter of time for the rest of the Eternals to fade away. I don't rank this dungeon higher for a very simple reason, and it's the design of the first two bosses. I don't very much like the first one, with its creepy little dolls that run around and suddenly kill your movement speed if they even graze you. I think the hitboxes on those are a little weird, as I found myself stopped in my tracks even though I'm certain I didn't touch the little critters. The boss is delightfully unnerving, even though creepy dolls have been slightly overused in Final Fantasy XIV. And then there's the teacup second boss. With this one, I find it hard to read the merry-go-round mechanics, where the boss puts two ghosts in teacups and then makes the stage turn, but the cups end in different positions and then blow up. I struggle to read where the cups are going to end up, and so can't move accordingly. It's most definitely a skill issue, I'll admit it, but it does rank it lower for me, despite the incredible creativity of the dungeon. The final boss is wonderful, with a clever mechanic of turning yourself ethereal and back again. Now number 2 is Alexandria, the final dungeon in the main story for Dawntrail at level 100. This place is awesome, a combination of traveling in virtual reality through the computer systems of living memory combined with a recap of Alexandria's fall. There's a lot of story in this dungeon to understand Fiend's tale and some of the toughest bosses in the entire game so far. I like the visual storytelling, how you begin in this idyllic period, very reminiscent of Final Fantasy IX's Alexandria town. And as you dive deeper both into the system and Fiend's memory, the town becomes increasingly damaged, until by the end you're standing in the ruins of another world. I love that the bosses are straight up computer programs. The first one being an antivirus cracked me the hell up. And even up to the Eliminator, you get the feeling you're just dealing with intrusion countermeasures, anti-malware, and other such protections. The Eliminator boss fight thoroughly kicked my butt the first time I did it. In fact, during that run, the Gunbreaker tank killed it on their own, with the rest of the party dead and watching. It was impressive, but also showed how much of a well put together dance this boss is. How if you execute the mechanics properly, you can avoid a lot of the damage. If there is a downside to this dungeon, is that the second boss, as fun as it is, isn't as memorable as the other two. Amalgam is certainly entertaining, but stands as the odd one when grouped with Antivirus X and the Eliminator. Just doesn't have the same thematic oomph, you know? I'll admit that part of it is just the name of the boss, but also it kinda breaks my rule because it's nowhere near as complex as the Antivirus X. And now for the best of the best of the best of the best that Dawntrail has to offer in terms of dungeons, Tender Valley. I mean, it's got bodybuilding cactuars. Do I need to say more? I do? Oh well, let's talk Tender Valley. This is the other dungeon unlocked after completing the MSQ, and it's one tied to the ancient ruins of the Yoghui, which supposedly guards an ancient secret of the giants, and the quest giver is a scholar with an interesting theory regarding the cultures across the reflections. Tender Valley kicks us off fighting packs of cactuars of all shapes and sizes, including an enemy called Tender Campeador. Campeador is a honorific that means the master of the battlefield, so maybe Battle Master would be more correct. In Spain, this title is almost exclusively used with a very famous historical knight known as El Cid, the Cid. So, El Cid Campeador, Battle Master Cid. Given how much Final Fantasy uses the name Cid, part of me wants to think this is intentional. And that leads us to Bro Tender, a very intense boss, one that at first glance is incredibly complex, but it has very clear visual cues, though it might take a try or two to figure all of them out. It's a very good fight, very fast-paced, the boss cycling through its abilities one after another in quick succession, so you gotta be on your feet. In fact, this is a common element of all the fights in Tender Valley, they keep you on your toes. This is the only dungeon where, for me, the highlight is the entire experience. The three bosses are very distinct from one another and each memorable in their own way. World's Strongest Cactuar I've already spoken about, but the second one, Bomberman, is a delight of a fight with a very clever mechanic. The boss on paper has very few abilities and it's simple, but it's the kind of fight that uses environmental elements to add to the challenge, and it might be my favorite fight of the entire dungeon. And then, for all of us who did the side quest in the Great Raktika Forest regarding the Great Serpent of Ronka, we have the Great Serpent of Tural waiting to squee at us in the depths of this temple complex, once again giving us a nice alternate version of a character we saw in another reflection. And if the other alternates hadn't already done so, this would have been the thing that convinced me beyond the shadow of a doubt that we'll be seeing more alternates and going to more reflections in the next major storylines. Plus, the maze mechanic for the Great Serpent is so good, and one that doesn't rely on any character ability, but all about your own perception. Can you figure out how to reach the safe spot before you expire? That's the challenge. Here's a clue if you're struggling. Work your way back from your destination and you'll find where to go. It's how I do it anyway. Tender Valley just delivers on all fronts, both story and engaging combat, so it's at the top of the ranking. Now, with all that said, if I were to rank the bosses independent of their dungeon, the list would look something like this. Number 24, we have Vanguard Commander R8. As I said, not much going for it. Doesn't feel that much different from the trash you fight on the way to him. Number 23, Rio Corterte. This fluffy little thing only has its cuteness going for it. Number 22, Drowsy. Much like number 23, its fluffy nature is its only advantage. I will say I like the living snot attack though. Number 21, Caderior, the boss that most thought would be the final one given that it was part of the cutscene preceding the dungeon. It unfortunately doesn't live up to the ferocity shown in that scene. Number 20, Feather Ray. Decent all around, but it's yet another random animal we butcher on the way to our objective. And of the 3 bosses in this dungeon, it's the least memorable. Number 19, His Royal Highness Leonok I. I hate these creepy dolls, not a fan of the mechanics of this fight. There's hectic and then there's annoying. This one leans in the direction of annoying. Number 18, Jack in the Pot. Again, I admit it's a skill issue, but I struggle with this boss a bit too much. I don't find its visual cues to be clear enough to consistently execute it. Number 17, Prime Punoti. The first Dawntrail boss and one that immediately tells you that the difficulty level is going to be very different from the previous expansion. Number 16, Gurfurlur, Dawn's Electric. Great boss, but would have liked to see more attack overlap. It's pretty simple and easy for a Dawntrail boss. Number 15, Maul Skull. The first real skill check in Dawntrail, a boss that will punish you for your mistakes. Not with overwhelming damage, but by pushing you off the platform. Number 14, it's Amalgam. Oh, Amalgam, you needed a better name and a much better skill set to stand shoulder to shoulder with your other dungeon companions. Sadly, you just don't measure up. Number 13, Herpecaris. The damage on this thing is insane. The poison will kill you, but it's middle of the pack in terms of the complexity of its mechanics. Number 12 is Deceiver. I like the mechanics on Deceiver. The hologram is telling you where it may be safe to stand for one mechanic and where not to stand for another one. Plus, it has some nice overlapping attacks. Downside is it summons way too many ads. Number 11 is Ambrose the Undeparted. Ambrose has a very dramatic name. I like the use of cages around him as part of his attacks and the changes in the floor. Number 10 is Xander the Snake Skinner. Great boss fight with a great multi-face design that is rarely seen in Final Fantasy XIV dungeons. Number 9, the Greatest Serpent of Tural. All hail the Greatest Serpent. Really fun mechanics, very much a boss focused on positioning. The maze is the highlight and I wish the boss used it more than once. Number 8, Traumarai, whatever. The 2 other bosses in Traumarai's dungeon, Strayboard or Deadwalk, may not get Halloween cards or trick-or-treats from me, but this Oogie Boogie gentleman certainly will. Love the use of spectral and material forms. They always give me a Soul Reaver vibe. Number 7, Firearms, the highlight of the Skydeep Cenote, plus a name that could easily go on a Gundam. Number 6, Antivirus X. Hey, even the Endless need a good antivirus. I love how clear the cues are, but also how small the time window is to properly execute the mechanics. This boss overlaps stuff like crazy. Number 5, Apollyon. From the very first dungeon and this high on the list, because it's such a fun encounter that progressively adds more mechanics and complications to the fight, while also giving you good damage windows. In terms of its phase progression, I see it as the precursor to Xander. Number 4, Protector. I said it before, this is the highlight of the Vanguard for me. The Bullet Hell is by far my favorite attack in the entire dungeon. Love how hectic this fight gets. Number 3, Barrel Tender. Gotta have my bro here, and I've already said enough about this boss. It's just phenomenal. Number 2 is Anthracite. Bomberman is the best boss in the expert dungeons. Its mechanics are simple and straightforward, but it has environmental elements that up the ante and make the fight way more interesting. And number 1, the Eliminator. The best of the best of the best is the Eliminator. By far the most complex and difficult fight in the entirety of the released dungeons for Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail. And that's it, that's the ranking of the dungeons and the ranking of the bosses. I'm still leveling all my jobs so I can take care of the role quests, so I'll be back with those at a later time. For now, do tell me, do you agree with my rankings? Tell me how you would stack the bosses and the dungeons yourself. But with that said, that's all from me. See you on the next one.